All right, it's recording. Cool. So, welcome to the talk, people. So the topic for today is going to be. I don't know if you can see this. So we're going to basically try to organize our code such that we have abstraction over how to get our configuration for the environment that we're in. What that means is that in different environments, we would have different configuration settings, right? For example, in our for our database, we would want to connect to a different database URL when we're in development versus when we're in test versus when we're in production, right? So the database URL is the most obvious because that's something we've been using all the time. But there's like other things that could happen too. Like if you are using some sort of an OAuth provider, you could have a client secret and client like ID different based on the different environments, right? So before we even start writing any code, I wanted to just get a sense of like what do we want, in what properties do we want, right, for our configuration. We basically want to use environment variables, right? So we want to use env variables for our configuration, right? So in our local development environment, we should be able to read a .env file, right? But in production, I would just like override those .env files. So we want to be able to override the env files in production. I also want an abstraction over a config. What that means is the person who is calling, who's the client of the config, right? So let's say the database file, which is like creating the database connection, that is going to be a client of the config because it will have to use the database URL, which is defined in the config. And that should not know about the internal implementations of how I implement the config. It should have no clue about the environment variable. It should just be like, give me the database config. Like, I don't care how the database config got in there, but I just want it out. So what that gives you is isolation, right? So if for some reason I decide to change the implementation of my configuration to not use environment variables and use something else, that should be transparent to the client. The client shouldn't care about it. It should be like, I still need a database URL, give it to me. I don't care how it comes to me. And then the third piece, the last piece is we want the configuration to be secure, which means like you don't want to expose leak the configuration variable outside of the scope of the config. So that way no malicious user can manipulate the config. So these are the different properties. Let's see how we can go about doing this. So one way to sort of think of designing the system is like going backwards, which is like how will I use this config? So think of like what will the client look like before you even start writing any code. So you have a bunch of features on the left, and I want to write down how the client would actually use the config. Right. So let's assume I have this file config/config. Right. So it's inside the config folder, and there's a config.js in there. So to get the config, I would expose some sort of a function called getConfig, which will give me the config. So I'm assuming that C returns like some sort of an object, and then the object has a property called getConfig, which is a function. So I can call the function and it'll give me the config. So if I console log the config, it should print the whole config, and then I should have some. So C should also have some other properties like getEnv, which will return what the environment is. And then inside of the config, which is this getConfig, whatever getConfig returns, I could have like more properties in there for different kinds of things. So there could be a config.db, there could be config.auth or auth or something, right? Some stuff like this. So if I run this, obviously nothing's going to work. Actually, I forgot. Like Tanner told me to use this thing called Keycaster, which is something that basically tells you the kinds of keys that I'm pressing. So every time I press a key, it's going to show some of these things. I don't know how useful that is, but let's see what happens. Okay, so now if I run this file, so if I say node, so this file is called foo.js, for lack of a better name. There's nothing defined, right? So it's like I don't understand what get config is. So what we need to do to make this pass, so kind of like TDD in a sense, right? Our test is on the left and our code is on the right. Sorry, our code is on the left and the test is on the right. So we need to return some stuff. So get config. Right now, it's just a random function. I don't know what it is yet. And then let's also return get env. Is also a random function, right? So now when I oops. How big is the font there? Okay. So is this okay for you to see? For the shell. So if I run node.js, oh yeah, I need to call this one. I wonder if, yeah, so this doesn't quite work. Okay. Cool. So now I got back undefined and undefined. So let's add some strings here. So this would be config. Let's get env. Yeah. Let's actually call it auth. Oops. All right. So get env was undefined. Config is also undefined. And then it's complaining that there's no such thing as db inside of my config because config is undefined. Right? So we basically need to make it pass. So the first thing that we want to do, we know that get env should just return. So what does get env do? It basically returns the environment that we're in. So if you're in development, it should return development. If you're in production, it should return production, right? And that's basically the environment variable process.env.node_env. Right, so that's easy. So we could say const get env equal to the function. All it does is return right, and this could just change to that. So I'm basically just returning process.node.env.node.env. I'm just like, so this is kind of like an abstraction, right? So tomorrow if I decide that, oh, node env is not a cool name, I want it to be node environment, I could change it. And the code here would still remain the same, right? So let's see what we get. Cool. So we got get env as development. Everyone seeing that? All right. So the next thing is we want to like look at config, right? So config. So we have, let's say, in development we need a .env file. Okay. DB name is contacts dev. And let's say DB host. Right, let's say this is the configuration .env file for our development. Right, so what we wanted was that one of our features was that we want to use environment variables for configuration, and we want to read the env file in development. So there's this package called .env. And what it does is it helps you, it has a bunch of functions that helps you read the environment variable. Sorry, the environment.env file, which has the environment variables and automatically adds it to the process.env. So whatever is in the file .env, it adds those into the environment variable. So all we need to do is call require.env and pass it the path to our config. So we want some sort of a variable here, which is a config. So let's create a function called make config, and also let's say const get config, just returns our config, which is this local variable there. Right. So what make config is going to do is it's going to modify this config in essentially. Right. So now when we run this, our config is undefined. So let's say if our config in the beginning is not undefined but an empty object. So this should now be our get config function. So now our config is an empty object, right? And then config.db is undefined because we haven't really done anything yet. So our get config will return config, and our make config will need to do some stuff, which is basically we want to read the env file in development. Otherwise, we want to use the env variables, which we assume will exist in production and staging and different environments. Right. So make config, we want to say something like if get env is development, right? Then we want to do some stuff. Read from read.env file, right? Else, otherwise we can say config is equal to the db is so host is process.env dot what is the db host, for port is process.env dot db port, and name right. So if we have this, we set our config and we return the config. And we're going to call make config here in the beginning. Right. So when this file loads, we want make config to be triggered so that it runs this function and it sets our config variable to this. So what do you think is going to happen so far? What do you think what do you think will happen if I run this again? Any guesses?
Currently in development, so have you given any instructions for what to do?
Right, but we are doing something. We're returning the config, right? So what do you think what's going to happen?
We haven't included the module for get env yet, so it's going to be undefined, isn't it?
I have get env is this.
I mean, you haven't actually loaded the module. The get env module.
Right. So exactly. So what's going to happen?
It's going to fail.
What is going to fail?
The DB is going to be undefined still.
DB is going to be.
It's going to be host port and name are going to be undefined.
Okay. Right. So now if I do this, I don't know if everyone can see this. Let me just right. So I get config is db host port and name undefined. Everyone get that?
Yeah.
Right? Because these things haven't been loaded yet. So I could potentially do some stuff like this too. So I have DB and I could say OAuth. What are the two things? Client ID. Right, I could do these two things as well. And then if I run this again, I see that config now contains DB as well as OAuth, but it's just that all the values are undefined. Right, so here we basically need to read the file. So here what we would say is require .env .config. Right, so if I do this, let's say so we're going to read the .env file and nothing happened. So most likely our paths are not, it's not able to read the file. So there is a way to pass the path, right? So I think by default, it thinks the config file is in the root, is basically in the current path. Like whatever the current directory is, there's a .env here, but it's not there, right? So a config .env file is here in the root of our folder, which is 2 levels down. So what we need to do is provide a path. Which is like return name plus all right. So we got some stuff this time. We got localhost, we got port, and we got name. Right. So let's say we change our file to .envs. What happens? It's undefined. Okay. So everyone see that? So we basically seeing the host as localhost, the port is 5432, and the name is context step. But our OAuth is still undefined. Anyone knows why that is?
You don't have that info.
What's that?
We never defined the variables in the env file.
Right. So what do we need to define here?
Client ID, client secret.
So you said client ID? Right, so that's some random stuff. So cool. Seeing that now, right? So why is this interesting? We have done a lot of stuff here. So the one thing I can say is that if I decide to change the way I'm storing my configuration file, if I change it from a .env file to something completely different, like I change it into a JSON file, I only have to change this file, which is the configuration file, the configuration module. Nobody else has to know anything about it. They would still have this sort of abstraction, which is like, oh, I would call get config, and I get back a config, and then I have these properties for my DB, and I have a properties of OAuth. If this whole structure remains the same, whatever I'm returning, things will just work as is. Like nothing special needs to happen from the client side, client's perspective. All the users of this code would be exactly the same. It's only that I would have to change this to be like, something else. Let's say if I was doing like JSON file is equal to require, config dot JSON, right? And I would have to say something like JSON file dot host. And I only have to change these places. Everything else remains the same. Did everyone get that? Okay, so let's try actually using this. So this is the same contact snapshot repository. So here, I have this connection string that I'm using here. So notice that in the code here, we're using process.env.database URL, which is fine. But I don't prefer it because I am assuming that it's always going to be process.env.database URL. And let's say I have this configuration used in multiple files. And if I decide to change it from database URL to DB URL, then I have to change all those places which are referencing this. And I could potentially have this in my tests. I could have this in source code. I could have it in like multiple places. And you should always be thinking of how many times do I have to change code if I decide to change the implementation. And if it's more than once, then something is wrong. So here, I would say const config is, so where are we? One level down, config. Let's call this as config. And right, so now a connection string changes. So I think PG promise can also take a connection object, right? If I remember correctly. Node PG promise. So connection should be in the beginning. Usage. Let's see. Imagine it to be in connect, database.connect, new database connection from a connection pool. How do I create a new connection object? Client database.connect. It's in database. That's kind of not helpful. PG comments.
I think the website you were at just a moment ago.
This one?
Over on the right, so it says connection syntax.
Oh yeah, perfect. Connection object, nice. All right, PGP and CN. Okay, this is what I wanted. So here, instead of connection string, I would say an object is oops. This would be and something like this. Right, so you're always taking it from the config. The config will be populated based on which environment you're in. And I would imagine in production you would have something more like username and password. So you'll have to add those two. The username, actually you should have the same thing. And then you'd have the same thing inside of the config. Use it, that's fine. So then I have to change my env file to add those two things. DB user. I don't think there's any password. So yeah, so these 5 things would be in your production database too. Right, when you create a new production database on Heroku, like we saw the other day, you had these 5 properties. And then those properties would just be added to in your, actually let's look at it. So if you go to Heroku, and I created this deployment 102. We had resources, database, so we have the host, we have the database name, we have the user, we have the port, and we have the password. So these 5 values would be added as environment variables in my settings. Right, so if I go to settings, I have the database URL here, but instead I would have something like db user and like db password, right? Basically those 5 values which match these 5. Questions so far? Yeah, Steve.
I have a few questions, but I'm going to try to keep them short. So my first question is, I noticed that when loading Postgres from our local machines, it seemed like I was trying to figure out how to make it work like in 2 different environments, and it seemed like we had to omit, unless we explicitly set up a local database with username and password, we had to completely omit those two properties because null didn't work.
Well, you can give your local username, right?
Yeah, I guess so. You can, but as far as maybe the answer is just give it a username and password. But I couldn't figure out how to make like a config object like that, making username and password blank, for lack of a better word, for local machine, but be able to populate it for
right. I would
production.
say try to be as consistent as possible in all environments.
Okay.
So if you're using a username or password in production, create a username and password in your local environment. Just because you don't have to write extra code to be like, oh, if you're in local, then have an empty username. Just try to be consistent. So that way you just have less code.
Okay, my next question is, can we go back to the config
Which one?
module?
The config module? Yeah.
Why did we do the extra step of make config to load all those variables when you could have also just, it seems to me, had the entire scope of make config like as a standalone, like executed when the module's loaded?
Oh, I see. Because I just want to like have the ability to reset the config.
Oh, to do it
later.
Like programmatically?
Yeah.
Why?
So,
because
I may want to, let's say in the test environment, I run a test with some config and I expect this to happen. Then I change the config to something else and I expect this to happen.
Oh, like literally change all the config variables in real time?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't think about that.
So would you just add like another condition, like if get env equals test, and then you would also put that in this file too, or would you create a separate config?
So right. So in the test, I could, since I'm using environment variables, I could just have like a file called like setup or something, test setup, and that just like sets all of my environment variables in my test environment. Right. So in my test, this wouldn't be executed because this would be false. Right. My get env function would say it's test, so this condition would be false. So all of these environment variables will be undefined unless I've given it some value, and I have to give it some value in the beginning of my tests. So I don't know if this has any tests here. So I would have some sort of a helper function. So this is a helper function called db. I would have a helper function called like setup.js, and I would just set up all of my. I would just say process.env.db name equal to something like this, and I would have to include this file in all of my tests. So that way these values are set. Does that make sense? Something like this.
So you can have multiple env files?
This isn't an env file. This is just a JavaScript file, which is going to be required in all of my tests. So let's say I had a test, like an integration test called contacts test. I would on the top, I would have to say require
So when you run the test, it's going to find that setup file, change out the environment variable once it hits that require.
Exactly. So when I require this file, it's going to evaluate this file. And when I evaluate this file, I'm setting up my environment variables for my test environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Just like how in production, the only way my environment variables were being set is because of this Heroku's interface where it lets me add these environment variables, right? So when it starts your node process, it's adding these environment variables to the shell that is running this node process in. Similarly, in our test, we have to do something similar. Nobody's going to do it for us. We have to make sure it happens. So this file, which is like a setup.js, needs to be required in all of your test files, such that this code is executed. Yeah, Jeffrey.
Just like, could you put all the things that, all the different environments in one file and just require like separate?
This should just, there should be like all like,
all of it for tests.
Yeah, all.
Production.
No. All the different environment variables just for your test environment would be in this file. In production, there's a different way of doing it, right? It's Heroku. In development, there's a .env file. So there's different ways to do it in different environments, but the way you fetch the config is the same, which is using get config, which under the hood uses process.env. So you have to make sure that process.env has all of the values that needs to exist for your config to be correct. So in your tests, you need to like set it up using some other way, using setup.
Into your database, your test database, and all that in the setup file, so that it goes pass it into the get config.
So repeat the question again.
So for like this, like say you're setting up your test, and you got the DB name, DB user, and then you have a separate test database that you're just testing.
Yeah.
Like put that connection in here too, so that it's swapped out in the config file.
Right. So you basically have to override the values. Right. So if you're using a different database in your test, make sure that process.env.db host has been overridden. So process. Something like this, right? Whatever. It's a different host.
So following up on what he just said, I guess presumably you could also have multiple functions in the config file, or potentially even pass an argument of an env file type, so that make config could load the proper env file for one for testing and for different.
Potentially, that's fine too.
Okay.
But I personally don't have any strong opinions. But if you like go with like the way the 12-factor app, those 12 rules.
Right.
And one of the rules in their configuration was just having one env file.
Oh, really?
Yeah. If I remember correctly, or maybe it was like the .env package actually. My bad. Maybe it's the .env package that said do not have different files for different configurations. So
I actually thought that was the point of you saying why you have a function like config, because you could have several functions that do different types of setup.
So we say, should I have multiple .env files? So we strongly recommend having a main.env file and environment.env file like env.test. Your configuration should vary between deploys, and you should not be sharing values between environments. So the 12-factor app, which I think is weird, because you don't have to share your env values. You can just have completely different two files which have all of the configuration values, and none of it is shared. So the sharing property can still be isolated by having separate files. Yeah, I'd say both of those things are fine. Okay. It just depends on your tech lead and how what their opinion is. But understand like what are the nuances behind what is going on under the hood, right? Like what are the choices and how they affect the way the app eventually ends up.
So it seems to me your earlier point was you should just have one place that you change any connections to.
Yeah, that should be true, right? That's like the major requirements, which is stuff here. And we want an abstraction over the config.
So be it that this config has like it seems like a default to development, which is where we're primarily working in. There would only be the test file would be the only thing that would be separate, and production is based on where you're deploying. So you only need to do this one and that one.
I don't understand the question.
I mean, you only really need to set up the production environment config, and then just have a separate file to switch it out for tests. But beyond that, you don't have to make the production.
Yeah. You don't. You're specifying the production config using the environment variables, and you're adding those variables in the production interface, right?
It made me feel like in the if and else statement, I think Ben was going down that path that to me, it seemed like we would have done if it's development do this, if it's test do this, if it's production do this.
No.
But we only do this one and then.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's because we don't. The way the process.env.db host is going to be set up is going to be different in test and different in production. Right? So in production, we're going to get it from the Heroku interface where we set it up and we add it here.
Oh, okay, so they allow you to add.
They allow you to add, yeah.
Okay. But this is an abstraction. Like if this wasn't here, you probably have to do another if and hard code this in.
If this wasn't here, then you would. So the idea is you don't want to save your production config in your code base.
Oh, okay.
You don't want like developers to see your production credentials, right? Like your production data has like some is important, so you want to keep it safe and secure. So only like 1 or 2 people in the company or the DevOps team may know it. Yeah.
The node EMV, who or what sets that? Or do you?
Oh, good question. Good question. So that happens. I think by default, Node env is developer actually. Yeah, I think Node env is set.
So you only.
So if we console.log,
So you when you're ready to put it on production, you would add a variable to say this is production logic.
yeah, somebody's setting it. Or actually, it may be my my bash profile. So here, yeah, it's my bash. So somewhere in my bash RC, I have Node env equal to developer.
So to put that in your logic, you pretty much are assuming
Yeah.
that it's going to be development, and then, like I was saying, if you explicitly put a different value on your production server or staging server, then it will be that only index.
Yeah, right. So I would have to like do.
You'd have to make an environment variable on the server.
Right. I'll have to say something like node underscore env is production.
Yeah.
But I think Heroku by default these days automatically adds this. But there's no harm in adding it. So
Okay.
add it, yeah. Just so that it's explicit.
Okay.
When you switch node environments, is there anything that actually happens to the app itself? Like it changes. I heard there were like optimizations when you go to production, and when you switch it to production, it does something. Bundles the app different or something.
I mean, you have to tell it to do all of those things.
Oh,
Yeah, it doesn't do things for you.
okay.
So like if you're using Webpack, you can use like a production like setting for Webpack, so that way it minifies AJS and obfuscates your code and all of that stuff. And that's that you have to tell it to do. Any other questions? Yep. So that was it. So isn't too bad, right? Like what do you think?
So this whole setup required 3 files.
Sure.
The test EMB, the other EMBs, and then this.
Yeah. But then you have to change all of the code which uses the environment variables and make it use the config instead, right? So we had to also change the DB file. Oops, not this one. DB. We had to change this file too, right? We had to use the connection object.
Oh,
Cool.
wait, what do you mean change it?
I mean, we were using this before,
Uh-huh.
and now we are not using that anymore. We're using this.
Instead of connection string, you're passing the PG promise connection object.
Yeah.
And that's just really
Oh.
And we're using connection object.
Because the only reason you capitalized config is you were just typing fast and you didn't feel like making a different.
No, because this is actually like not really the config. It's more like the yeah. I mean, I could have done this actually. So that isn't really the config. It's more like the the class which gives me the config.
And why are you executing it versus that's the first time I've seen a module like self-execute before versus just including
Which line are you talking about?
the config module. You have it self-executing on the config module itself.
Oh, I see. Here?
That's the just to the bottom. You have
Oh, I see.
execute itself.
Yeah, because I wanted to create this private variable, so it's a closure.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Right.
I wanted to this shouldn't be exposed to the outside. I only want this to be manipulated by functions within this module, which is like make config, but essentially.
Oh, I get it now. So that's why you have the methods to suck in what people need and spit it back out versus going to it directly.
Yeah,
Everything else.
nobody can directly manipulate this config variable.
I understand. Okay.
Yeah, so technically I could potentially even just do this. I'm gonna get rid of this.
Instead of config.config.
Yeah, I got rid of that extra
Okay.
because I don't really need to capture the function get config. I'm just calling it.
Okay. That's why we do functions. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you.
So I'm going to upload this video. How do I stop video? Oh no, I need to stop the share.